Kent has embraced the land, the sky, and water in his work. And he's inspired by nature, trees, the plains, and the beautiful lakes of Minnesota. Tonight, we're going to hear about his grandmother, Josephine Robinson, who really influenced his work quite a bit, albeit that her work was three-dimensional. Kent's work so far is two-dimensional, but he will talk about that in a pre-recorded video that really stemmed from an article that was in the 1978 Star and Tribune entitled Tribal Memories. He was also inspired by Native American artist George Morrison. He's going to talk about that a little bit. And then he's also going to talk about how his work has evolved over the years, from a youngster when he first started doing drawings and painting, and how that's evolved into what he has done today. He has a huge exhibition up in Grand Rapids right now. So his work is very inspiring. I'm excited to hear him. And Kent, take it away, please. Kent?
All right, bonjour. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to teach you two Ojibwe words tonight. The first one is bonjour, which means hello. And the other word, actually I'll teach you three. The other word is anin, which is another word for hello. Depending on who you say hello to, of my Ojibwe people, some will answer and they'll say bonjour back to you, or some will say anin, but that they both mean the same thing. And the last thing I'll do tonight is I'll say giga wabamin, which means see you later, because there is no word for goodbye in Ojibwe. So it's always, we will see you later at another time. So we'll practice that. We'll practice that later. So thank you for having me tonight. And I'm anxious to share with you the story of my grandmother, who she was the first artist that I knew. And she still impacts my work today. So I'm going to go ahead and start this presentation. And then as soon as this presentation is done, I'll have left room for questions, okay? All right. Before we begin tonight's talk, I need to share with you that you'll be hearing me say Indian, and you'll also be reading the word Indian. That's intentional because you'll hear that used by my grandmother, and you'll read it in her quotes as well. It would be more appropriate today to use Anishinaabe or Native American, so please excuse me if this may be somewhat uncomfortable. All right, I'm going to begin tonight's talk with a question. How will you tell your story? My grandmother, Josephine Robinson, said, people find a way to tell their story. I tell mine as I make baskets. My grandmother was born in 1893 and lived on the White Earth Reservation in northwestern Minnesota in a very small town called Naytawash. Some of her journey will be shared with you tonight, as well her artistry. The audio clips that you'll hear tonight was recorded in 1968 by a doctoral student researching Native American history. My grandmother, we called her Ma. She was the first real artist that I knew. She was a black ash basket maker for most of her life. This talk is about a story of loss and also a story of resilience. My grandmother used her basketry as her way to tell her story, an important story of life on the reservation. So how are you telling your story? Are you telling your story through your artistry? I really believe that we all have important stories to tell. Most recently, the pandemic has become an important part of our stories. It may be even showing up in your art. I know it has mine. The pandemic has changed us. Some of us have lost family, friends, and ways of life. Things have changed, and life may be a lot different for some of us. So I'm asking you tonight, how will you tell this story? I think as artists, we have an advantage over others. We can not only use our words, but also use our brushes, our hands, to speak our hearts using a variety of tools in a variety of ways. Is your story told through your art? This is a piece that's called Tribal Memories. A few years back, I created this piece, and today it is part of my Hope and Healing exhibition in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. It first appeared in the We Are Still Here exhibition during the St. Paul Art League a few years back. The Tribal Memories comes from an article I found tucked away in my filing cabinet. An article that I hadn't read in many, many years. This article was featured in the Saturday section of the Minneapolis Star and Tribune that was published in 1978. As I reread this article, the following phrase literally jumped out of the page at me. You'll always run across people who make you understand that you're just an Indian. Think about that. Make you understand you're just an Indian. Well, I can tell you that that sentence haunted me. I couldn't get it out of my head, and immediately and ultimately I was shocked, and I couldn't get it out of my heart because it hurt. And it was then that the only way I felt that I could express this feeling was through my art. It became a way to tell this story, this important story of my grandmother. So this Tribal Memories piece is a collage in honor of my grandmother, Josephine Robinson. It tells some of the story of her life growing up on the reservation and tells a story of some of her experiences in the residential boarding schools. Ultimately, this piece speaks to some of the trauma that she experienced as a child and young adult. The intent with this piece is to tell just enough of her story for you to begin to ask some questions, because a lot of this is not found in history books. Unfortunately, you need to do the research for yourself. At first glance, you may think this piece is just about loss, the loss of her language, the loss of her cultural ways, the loss of her land. After all, when she left the reservation, she spoke only Ojibwe. When she returned, all she spoke was English. Her story is the beginnings of the historical trauma that Native people are experiencing today, some 100 and more years later. Also, her story is about resilience and also healing. Like I said earlier, my grandmother was an artist, although she certainly wouldn't call herself that. She just made baskets. Her basketry really didn't become important and popular until she was in her 70s, and by that time she couldn't keep up with the orders. She would demonstrate her basketry at Itasca State Park during the summer, and eventually at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. When she demonstrated her artistry, she would tell her story, an important story of life on the reservation when she was young. The baskets that she used to sell for 35 cents are now selling for $100 or more. Look at those prices, she'd say. That's just terrible. Well, that was her way of saying she was proud of her work. That was her way. Over the years, my wife and I would see her baskets in numerous museums across the nation. It was always an unexpected and welcome surprise. Her baskets would be enjoyed by many prominent people that included the President of the United States and many senators. Tonight, for a few minutes, we are going to hear from my grandmother again. We're going to read her words and hear her voice, that black ash basket maker, the artist from Naytawash. Josephine Elizabeth Robinson, Ma, as we called her, was born in 1893. These were extremely hard times for the Native Americans, especially the children. She was born at a time when the White Earth Reservation had been recently established. Her family was one of the first to settle on the White Earth Reservation. All Indian tribes have names for themselves. The largest Indian group in Minnesota calls itself Anishinaabe, which means the original people. Europeans called us Ojibwe. No one is exactly sure how its name developed. Perhaps it came from the Anishinaabe word Ojib, which describes the puckered moccasins worn by the people. My grandmother lived in a time when families lived off the land. They lived by the lake and in the woods. They hunted, they fished, and they really lived a simple life. They had their own traditional religion, a religion that was all about the respect of others and their respect of nature. People always went by the seasons, my grandmother said, not by the date or the year. I was born on the full moon during rice making. My sister was born when the crows came in the spring. Jacob Redbird was born, they say, when the buds were forming on the trees. It must have been March. One of my cousins was born when the crabapple blossoms were blooming. Everything was seasonal and somehow related to nature. It was a simple life my grandmother lived. Her family lived in one of the first stick-built homes in the Naytawash area. They had a farm that included a blacksmith shop, a carpentry shop, and granary on the property. Her grandfather and her father worked and managed the Buffalo Bill Wild West show.
Buffalo Bill was down here. I forget what year that was, but he came down here and visited my people. I remember him because I was just a kid. He held me on his lap, but I remember that. And he knew my grandfather really well because he used to travel with us. And he used to take a bunch of Indians from here and travel in the show. And he just happened to be in town. So I told her, I said, let's walk downtown. I said, I'd like to see. We used to call him Bigelow. That's the name we had for him, Bigelow. And I don't know why he called him that. Maybe we couldn't pronounce the buffalo or something. But that's the name we gave it. And I said, let's go down and might see Bigelow. I said, she heard a lot about him too, but she didn't really know him. When we was walking across the street, we seen that man standing across the street from us with his long hair and a long coat. I said, there he is. I said, there's Bigelow. And she used to stop, and you seen it, he come right across the street to us. He says, Indian girls, he says, he shook hands with us. And then he started to ask us who we were, where we were from, who our people were. Or he was asking her, and I was just saying it all in, he turned around to me, and I told him my father was Tyler Warren. He just grabbed me. He said, I know you. He said, well, he used to call me Jessie as a little girl. He called me Jessie. You're a little Jessie, he said. He was so glad to see me.
My grandmother lived during the time when the federal government had begun to systematically remove her language and culture and traditional spirituality. There was a national policy to deal with the Indian problem. The groundwork was put into place a federal educational system because they thought that it would cost less to educate the savages instead of killing them. In 1875, the government had banned all drumming, singing, and dancing for anyone 50 years and younger, thinking that when the elders died, those practices would die also. And for the most part, it worked. In 1882, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs wrote a letter expressing the United States government policy towards Indian religious freedom. There is no good reason why an Indian should be permitted to indulge in practices which are repugnant to common decency and morality. The preservation of good order on reservations demands of me active measures be taken to discourage and, if possible, put a stop to the demoralizing influence of heathenish rites, Price's letter said. My grandmother and her family were called pagans and heathens. According to one of our White Earth tribal historians, violators on the White Earth Reservation were punished under something called Indian offenses. Food rations were withheld. People were jailed. Children, they were taken from parents and sent to government boarding schools. It is said that nearly 25% of all children on White Earth and Red Lake were simply taken away and adopted out across the United States. Indian spirituality and cultural practices had to go underground. My grandmother's family practiced the traditional religion, which she recalls as a beautiful thing. And she believed that they were better people because of their religious beliefs.
Well, they were better people than some of these Christians I know. I know they're better person. If I wasn't a belong to a church, I believe I'd be a better person I am today. That's really lived right. And they come here and tell us, these evangelists come around here and preach to the people. They call us Indians pagans. There never was such a thing as a pagan Indian. We all are free in the Holy Spirit, the Spirit above, God in heaven. We all agree that. I was taught that from the time I was a little baby, little kid. And all these red medicine people believe in God. I can't understand why they come here and call us pagans. It's impossible for an Indian to be a pagan when they live right close to nature. Yeah, it's impossible.
Growing up, my grandmother lived a simple, traditional life. She was a member of a respected family where all of nature and the land were respected. It was a part of who they were as Native people. We were taught not to even mark the trees. They were put there by the Holy Spirit. The old people believed there was a spirit in everything. We lived by a creek. We were not allowed to throw anything dirty in the creek or on the lakeshore. We were taught to have respect for water. This was the time when Congress authorized the Commissioner of Indian Affairs to create legal rules that required Indian children to attend boarding schools. During these years, Indian agents forcibly abducted children as young as 4 from their homes and enrolled them in Christian and government-run boarding schools. In 1902, my grandmother would begin her formal education in the first Minnesota Indian boarding school. It was located in White Earth, Minnesota. This was one of 16 boarding schools across the state of Minnesota. In 1902, the year my grandmother attended, White Earth had room for 102 students. I was 9 years old, and I was punished all the time. They used to put me in the corner. Why? Because I didn't know English. They'd ask me a question. I didn't answer. They thought I was stubborn. They'd put me in the corner. At the time, I didn't know they were punishing me. I didn't know one word of English. Sometimes we were strapped, my grandmother said. We had to march in step everywhere we went. We had to be in a line. It was just like military school. Everything had to be on time. She was 9 years old. After a few years in White Earth, she left the reservation to attend another boarding school. This was the Pipestone Indian Trade School in Pipestone, Minnesota. She went to finish her grade school education there. She was only allowed to come home on the extended holidays. Recently, my wife and I visited the Herd Museum in Phoenix, Arizona. They had an exhibit titled Away from Home that is dedicated to the Indian boarding schools. This was a very difficult exhibit to experience. Immediately, you are immersed in the experience by a barber chair with hundreds of braids scattered on the floor, and then all the students dressed the same. They all looked alike with their haircut. This was the beginning of the assimilation process, the strategies and policies of the federal government. I can tell you now that I was overwhelmed. Suddenly, my wife called out my name. She said, "Kent, come here, look." On the wall, in the classroom of the exhibit, there were words of my grandmother. We had no clue that they were there. On the wall were these words. I couldn't talk a word of English. All I talked was the Ojibwe language. Josephine Robinson, Ojibwe, Pipestone Indian School. My grandmother's words. I can tell you that that day, her words spoke volumes to me and began this journey of telling her story, a very important story of this basket maker from the White Earth Reservation. You'll always run across people who make you understand that you're just an Indian. In 1910, my grandmother left Pipestone and went off to another government school, this time in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The Carlisle Indian School was founded in 1879 in an abandoned army post. This was the model for American Indian boarding schools. The goal of Carlisle was to strip all of the Indian culture from the Indian students. These institutions prepared the boys for manual labor and farming, and the girls were prepared for domestic work. The boarding schools, whether they were on or off a reservation, carried out the government's mission, which was to restructure Indians' minds and personalities. They did that by severing children's physical, their cultural, and spiritual connections to their tribes and their families. They were to only speak English. They were to dress in the American style. They were to eat American foods, and they were to worship the Christian God in the American way. And they were to live in American style houses. You can go to the Carlisle Indian School website and search the student records. Here are some of my grandmother's documents that I was able to find. They have personal letters from parents asking permission of the school to allow their children to come home on holidays or send them home over the summer months. Parents had to request permission. My grandmother was student number 3,981. She attended school half days. The rest of the time, she worked and lived in the homes of white families. This was to aid in the assimilation process. She was trained to clean the house and to sew.
So they get used to living with the white people and know how they live, and they taught us how to do the kind of work that they were doing, such as cleaning house and being homemakers. And then besides, they used to pay us a little money each week. And our money used to be sent back to the school, and then during the winter time, we used to draw that money and we used it.
My grandmother went on to say, we'd get up at 4 a.m. and clean the house and go to school at 9. And then we'd come home at 4 and work some more. These schools also extensively utilized something that was called the outing program. And what that did was retain students for the summer months, and the school leased them out to white homes as menial laborers. Some people were good to us and some weren't so nice. Some would treat us like members of the family and others treated us like servants. The people who treated us that way would make us do our work and then we'd have to go to our rooms. We couldn't play with their children or go to their parties. You always run across people who make you understand that you're just an Indian. She left Carlisle Indian School and returned to the reservation in 1915. She worked as a matron, sewing clothes for the children at the school in Whiter. She was married to my grandfather, William Robinson, in 1917. She recalls that everything was different when she returned to Naytawash. The family farm was gone, and most of the Indians had sold their land. This was after the Clapham Amendment had removed restrictions on allotted land. And what that did was set off a buying spree as farmers from the Red River Valley, the banks and lumbering companies moved in on the White Earth Reservation to buy, more likely swindle, the allotments assigned to the White Earth tribal members. Historians say the land was sold even if the Indians were full blood, which was against the law. But if you had some white blood, just a bit, then you could sell your land because you were thought to have business sense. And so suddenly, a lot of the Anishinaabe people were said to not be full blood. They were white, just enough to sell their land.
On the mother's side, I think grandma was a full blood, and so was my mother. She was considered a full blood, but after this reservation opened for the Indians were allowed to sell their land, or every Indian had a little white blood in them time so they could sell their land.
The reality was that the people were poor. They couldn't speak English, and oftentimes they were desperate. They didn't realize that they were surrendering their land titles, and all it took was a thumbprint. My stepfather mortgaged my land. He did it for $250 to buy a team of horses. A horse and buggy were about the only thing you could travel around in at that time, she said. The land sharks around here got land any way they could from the old people. My mother told me how she put down her thumbprint on a piece of paper. She couldn't write. She couldn't speak English. My mother lost her land that way. She didn't know she was losing her allotment. Why? Why did they want the land? Because of the timber and the rich agricultural land on the White Earth Reservation. My grandmother said, some people didn't know what they were putting their thumbprints down for. Some thought that they were just renting their land. A lot of people lost their land through taxes. I had a friend, she told me how they paid for her allotment. They gave her a lot of $1 bills and put it in her apron. She thought it was a lot of money, but all it was $100 for 160 acres. The white man takes everything away from the Indians, my grandmother said. You'll always run across people who make you understand you're just an Indian. One of my favorite quotes from my grandmother was, "We've never been treated right, so we take things as they come. There's nothing we could do about it, I guess." Well, she said, we still have our Indian summers once in a while. They can't take that away from us. My grandmother, through it all, retained her humor and her spirit. That's resilience. The ability to get up after traumatic events occur in one's life. Despite all the loss of her youth, the trauma, she wasn't bitter or resentful. Her way of dealing with all the loss was this process of making baskets and telling her story where and whenever she could. She began making baskets when she returned from the Carlisle Indian boarding school. My grandmother was taught black ash basketry by a woman who was from the Ottawa tribe of Canada. She would tell the story of meeting this woman at the local Episcopal church gathering. The woman, after the church service, made a motion for her to follow her into the woods. My grandmother said she had an axe. Well, although she couldn't fully understand her, she watched and learned. Soon they had found the right black ash tree. She chopped it down and the process began. This process took many days to complete one basket. They began by soaking the tree, removing the bark, and pounding the log until they could begin peeling the growth layers to reveal the splint for weaving. Each splint had to be split and shaved with a knife, and then cut to size, either with a scissor or some type of blade. This process is a very labor-intensive process and was new for my grandmother because, after all, the Ojibwe people made baskets of birch bark. In her early years, she made her baskets to carry wild rice and fresh-picked berries. She colored her splint with natural dyes made from sumac, chokecherry, blackberry, bloodroot, and blueberries. And she adorned her baskets with sweetgrass. In the 1970s, her baskets would gain attention and were distributed by a company that was called Lady Slipper Designs. They helped market her baskets and they sold them all around the nation and even overseas. My grandmother, Josephine, continued to make her baskets well into her 80s, and she shared her artistry with her family. Over the years, she would be interviewed countless times about her basketry, and along with that, about her life on the White Earth Reservation. She used her artistry as a way to tell her story. She taught my father to make baskets, and in turn, he taught my brothers, and they taught their family, and the tradition continues today. I've been asked many times, why do I do art? It's simple. It's simple for me. I do it, I think, so I can tell this story, my grandmother's story, who was the first artist I knew, and also tell my story. Her story of tribal memories was important back in 1978 and earlier. And I think, this story is more important today. The boarding school era, the loss of language and culture has impacted generations, and the trauma of all of that is still felt today by the Anishinaabe people. Today, we've learned that even the descendants of Native people who have not directly experienced a traumatic event can still exhibit the signs and symptoms of trauma. Most of the time, you'll see trauma manifested as depression, low self-esteem, anger, self-destructive behaviors, suicide, or substance abuse. I realize that we cannot change history. We cannot undo my grandmother's story, but what we can do now is tell this story. Tell a story of loss, yet tell a story of resilience, because what they couldn't take was us. As Native people, we are still here. Remember that. We're still here. People find a way to tell their stories. I tell mine as I make my baskets.
Okay, so if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have about tribal memories. And then we will move on to what I do and a little bit about my story.
And if people would like to ask the question themselves, go ahead and unmute and ask Kent directly. Or if you're more comfortable sending a question in the chat, Kent is able to see that also. So Kent, I do have a question. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what's happening to restore some of the lost traditions of language, singing, dance, religion. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening with your people?
Sure, absolutely. Well, the exciting news is that this generation, this next generation, has taken up the cause. And it wasn't very long ago that our tribe reported that we had just 1 or 2 fluent Ojibwe speakers remaining on our reservation. And the White Earth Reservation is the largest reservation of about 25,000 members. And we only had 2 or 3 fluent speakers remaining. And so what communities did, they got together and they started recording the language of the fluent speakers. And since that time, I would say over the last 15 years, there's been a resurgence of an interest in the communities to learn the language. And but it's a community thing that happens. It's the community that needs to take on that challenge. Universities like Bemidji State University and Fond du Lac University and White Earth Tribal Community University, they also have courses now in Ojibwe. So we're coming along, and school districts now are also receiving some federal dollars. And with that component and with those dollars, they're able to try to bring the language back into the school districts. So it's happening. I mean, is it there? No, we have a long ways to go. So if you were to, if I were to simplify this, when my grandmother returned to the White Earth Reservation and had her family, my mother never heard Ojibwe spoken in her home. My grandmother never spoke the language because it was beat and shamed out of her. And so my mother never learned the language. And so she never taught us the language as well. So what they did worked. They were very effective at what they did, because when you remove the language, if you can remove that language, then that's the beginning of taking away everything. And that's what they did. And so it's taken a long time. It's taken a long time, but thank goodness we have a lot of young people today that are picking up the language and they're sharing that now with their family and friends.
And how about some of the cultural traditions of celebration?
That is also a community thing. So we are seeing our little community of Nadawash has their own little drum group, and we have a yearly harvest festival. That's a community powwow. Our White Earth Reservation has an annual powwow around June 14th. And there's thousands of people that come to that. So each community has taken on a little bit and tried to encourage people. And so it's coming along. It's coming along.
Mm-hmm. And you talked with Art and I about the huge impact of poverty because of all of this loss. It's very similar to what's happened in other communities around the US, where that generational wealth is not available to anyone.
Absolutely. My wife and I worked for our community school. We helped establish the community charter school in Nadawash. And, one of the things that we would share with people, especially non-native teachers who are coming to our school district, is I would always caution the people, and I would say, don't judge the families, the native families, by what you see. Is you may not understand what you see, and what you see is not cultural. What you're seeing is the result of poverty. And that's a whole different thing. Being poor and impoverished is not a cultural thing. And so please don't judge our people, don't judge our students by what you may see. And I always cautioned and told the teachers, please don't pity our students, educate them. That's the best thing that you can do, is please educate them. And so, that's, I went to school here. I was able to work with my community and work with the children of this community. And it really was an absolute honor to be able to do that.
So Kent, we have a question from Lynn. She was wondering what the purpose or purposes of the charter school, the White Earth Charter School that you and your wife taught at. What were some of the fundamental issues that you were trying to get across when you were teaching?
So first of all, charter schools are just like any other public school. They need to abide by state guidelines and statutes. We are tested the same, just like Edina. We're tested the same way in Nadawash. And so, it's a public school. The things that are different is that you have an authorizer, and your authorizer helps you along and monitors the school district. Our school was monitored, or our authorizer were the volunteers of America, the Minnesota chapter. And what we focused on was language, the Ojibwe language. You have to have a theme for your charter school. And our focus were two things, or three things actually. So it was the language and culture, high technology, and that was my job. And also connection with the community, or community service. So that was our foundation for the school. But otherwise, it's just like any other public school.
Any other questions for Kent?
So I have a question. This is I'm wondering, it's unfortunate, obviously, that the government, and you pointed this out in the 1880s, basically stripped away all the, starting with language, all the cultural aspects of your tribal community. And I know this happened to other indigenous peoples as well. So I've always been curious to know how much sharing occurred between the Ojibwe White Earth community and, let's say, I'm going to say another tribal community like Eastern Sioux or other communities that you know of.
So what did we have in common?
What did you have in common, and were you aware of the differences in cultural aspects?
Yeah, it's different. It's different. The language is an interesting thing because each tribe has their own dialect. And language, we can't, one of the projects that we did on our school website is we recorded words from one of our tribal elders, Ojibwe. And, and we did that for our community, okay, for White Earth and the Nadawash community. But now if you were to travel to Fond du Lac, you would hear some of those words, but they may say them a little bit differently. And Canada actually has done probably or spent more time in recording their language, but it's different from the Minnesota Ojibwe. Words are similar, but it's different. So you can't come out with it's difficult to come up with, this is the way this should be spoken. So because it may not be true for your community or your band, or so it does pose some issues there. But what I was always told is, don't be afraid to make mistakes with the language. Just speak it and do the best you can, because others need to hear it. And that's the only way that we're going to regain the language. So, we may make mistakes, or things may be different in this part of the state or whatever, but that's okay. We just need to try. And I think that was good advice.
There's a question here from Lainey. She says, how and when were you able to learn the Ojibwe language?
I can tell you this without hesitation. My wife taught at the Circle of Life School in White Earth. She was a kindergarten teacher there for many years. She's non-native. She knows more Ojibwe than I do. And the reason is because she was around the language more than I was. They were teaching the language in White Earth at that school. Okay, now where I went to school, even though the population was 98% Native people in my elementary school, and then over 60% Native in high school, we never heard the language. And of course, my mother would never speak the language because she didn't know it.
Mhm.
So my father, who was on his own, and he was on his own since 12, and he was also a product of the boarding school. He picked up a lot of language along the way, but we never heard it at home. Never heard it at home. So, that when you're shamed for using your language, and you're beat for using your language, you do pass that on to the next generation. And it was very effective. And so, I missed out on all of that. I know a few words, and I try, and I do the best I can. But now I've got a niece who is one of her forte is creating immersion schools, Native immersion schools, where they only speak the language. So I'm so proud that it took, it's in the hands of my niece, who is teaching the language, and she would be considered almost fluent now. So it's happening.
But 3 generations, that's
Three
a lot
generations.
of lost time.
Well,
It is, yeah.
Well, so we have a question from Lynn, who wants to know when you were drawn to create, and what describe your beginnings, I guess, in the art world.
I've always wanted to. I was always creating, and growing up in the little village in Natawash, where there's 150 people, 150 students we have right now, and about 450 people, I would say. Of course, it was smaller than that when I was growing up. I lived a wonderful life, the youngest of 7. We had our own 280 acres, and it was a beautiful life, just, hunting, fishing, gardening. My parents did a variety of things. Most of the time they were sewing, creating, inventing, because if you lived in my house, you were probably going to be some type of artist. That being, of course, back then we didn't call you an artist, right? So we were playing, you were either going to play the piano, You were going to play the guitar, you were going to play the accordion, you were going to play the mouth organ, you were going to play the mandolin, you were going to sew clothes, you were going to build furniture, you were going to make black ash baskets, or you were going to make things out of birch bark. Notice I didn't say painting.
Mhm.
So everybody, you know, back then we would call those hobbies, right? They're just hobbies. And but today that's art. That's art. And so with being the youngest of 7, and we were it was a good life, but pretty poor. There were a lot of mouths to feed. I remember as a kid always yearning to see art, to see beautiful paintings. I knew there had to be them someplace. And I remember going to on the side of our barn and mixing dirt and sand and clay with water, and that was my paint. And I would paint on the side of our barn. I knew I wouldn't get in trouble from my dad for doing that, but I didn't have paint. I just didn't have the tools. And I found this old paintbrush that my dad used to use for painting. He would build rice boats. And I remember painting with these, you know, the sand and the dirt, and I remember seeing color. I mean, I could see color. And I thought, and I remember as that little boy thinking, will I ever be able to see real art? Will I ever be able to leave Netawash, this little bitty town, and go to a museum or go to a gallery and see real artists' work? Full circle. Now I'm going to galleries and museums to see my work hanging on the walls of these places that I thought I would never get to see. And so it happens. And a part of the story, why I tell my grandmother's story, is because she was that first artist that I knew. She said, if she could do this, making these baskets and become an artist and be at the Smithsonian and you know, people loving her work, I could do the same. But she had to set that path for me. And, you know, I was always the odd one. and I, like I said, I began painting with dirt and sand. And then I got to high school and I found an art teacher who cared enough about me and saw my talent that I spent as much time as I could in the art room. While others were out eating lunch, where others were doing other things, I would sneak into the art room and paint, because I knew that's what I was going to do. Okay, I'm gonna graduate from high school and go to college, and I'm gonna become an art teacher, right? I went to Bemidji State University. I walked by the art department. I looked in the classroom, and I kept walking. I was scared. And I never took one art class while I was in college.
Oh my God.
Not one. And
Wow.
I kept walking, and I ended up in the radio and television department. And that's where I stayed. And then went back years later and got my education degree. And then my master's degree, but I never ever took an art class. And I think it was fear. It was just too close. And so, but I always painted. And, you know, I did that for family and friends. And I taught myself to do that. And yeah, today I think, you know, I wish I would have had some color theory and made some of these things, you know, but I'm doing okay. I'm doing okay. And I think of my grandmother's baskets and the beautiful colors and how she would mix those together. And I go to powwows and I see the beautiful colors and how they blend together and mix with the sound of the powwow. And that's where my creations come from. So maybe I don't need color theory. I just need to go to a few more powwows.
Well, like you said, your art is what's in your heart.
It is, absolutely it is. Yeah.
Lynn has another question too. She said, will you talk about how you discovered Morrison and other influential Native artists?
Sure. Should I go into my presentation?
I think that would be a good
because
time.
Yes.
You'll be able to ask some questions and let me see if I can you see this window?
No.
Okay, let me get back here.
Do I need to?
I think I'll have to share my screen again.
Yeah.
Okay, how about now?
Yes. No.
Yep.
Okay, great. So this is what my work looks like today. And like I said, I have been I started what I started to paint because it was comfortable for me were landscapes. This doesn't necessarily look like a landscape, and it took me a long time to get here, and I'll share with you why it took a while. So for 30 years, this is what I painted. I would paint only with oils. After all, when I was in high school, that's all we painted with. And that's all I knew. And I knew how to move the paint. And I was very comfortable using using oils. I painted, I guess, hundreds of pieces over the years, and they all had something to do with sky, lake, trees, water. I was very comfortable in doing that. But the thing that changed was after many years, as people got to know my work through family and friends, they would say to me, Kent, could you paint an eagle in that? Could you paint a wolf in there? Could you put a teepee in there? And you're a Native artist, so could you do those things? Right? You just automatically have the ability to do that. And for many years I did that. You know, I thought that being Native American, that was the only way I could share my artwork and express myself. So I did that for a while until I came across and started to do some research, and I found the work of George Morrison. And George Morrison was a Native artist. He grew up on the North Shores of Lake Superior. By the way, he's the artist on our next stamps that are coming out. Maybe they're out now, I'm not sure. But he's coming, his work is coming out shortly on the postage stamps. He spoke to me, and he was a landscape artist. And what you'll see in his work as you research it is that there is typically a horizon line somewhere in his work. But they sure didn't look like the landscapes that I was painting, although this made sense to me. His work, really excited me because, okay, here's a Native American artist who is not doing, I don't see any teepees in his work. And how did he get there? And so I researched his life, and he, in one of the statements that made so much sense to me, he said, you know, I'm not a Native American artist. I'm an artist who just happens to be Native American. And that made so much sense to me. And he's the one that gave me permission to break free from painting that teepee, that wigwam, that eagle in pieces. And it came just at the right time. And so I put away oils. That was the scary part, is I put away the oils and I picked up acrylics. And I thought, oh, I'm never going to be able to move the paint the same way as I did with oils. But I learned how. I learned how. I was found on the internet. I created a website and I started to put some of my work out on the internet. And the Watermark Art Center from in Bemidji found my work. And they invited me to, they were opening up their new museum, and they had an open call for Native artists to submit pieces of work. And I thought, okay, this is interesting. But what I'm going to do is I'm not going to submit as traditional landscape, although that's what they were expecting. I said, you know what, I'm going to start painting what I want to paint, what I feel inside. And I want to start telling my story, not somebody else's story. And so this was the first piece that I created for an art gallery, a museum. And this is acrylics. This has a washer. It has a stone from the shores of Lake Superior. And it has some copper wire. And I thought, well, you know, if they say no, they say no. And I submitted it and they loved it. And it was put in the Meekanon Gallery in the new Watermark Art Center in Bemidji. And the thing is, it sold right away. And I was thinking, why, how does that happen? and so that was an extra bonus. There's somebody else that might like my work. And I thought, okay, I can keep maybe doing this. And so this was my first piece away from a traditional landscape. My work took a turn, and I started to do larger pieces, which I do today. I like working with large canvas. I like to show movement and on the canvas. And so pieces like this started to come out, and boy, did it feel good to be able to do this, because this is what was in my brain. This is what I was seeing, and this is what I wanted to do. And you'll notice that in this piece, I also, it might be a little hard to see, but I started to use metallics paint. And I still use that today because it's a way for the piece to catch light. Just another layer of paint that will catch the light. Again, here's a big piece that is, if you hang it, it's probably 8 feet wide and 36 inches, 40 inches tall. This is what I was seeing. And if it wasn't for George Morrison, I would have never done this. I would have never created pieces like this. This is acrylic inks. And over the top, there's also metallics. It's all acrylic. And this piece hung in the Watermark Art Gallery as well. It finally ended up in the home in Arizona. Other mediums that I use. Through the COVID times, I had some time on my hands. And so I started to explore the use of resin. And I started to create my own, with pigments, I started to create my own paints. And I started to add that to resin. And it was more traditional, again, going back to somewhat a more traditional looking landscape piece, but just done in a different way. And I've enjoyed working with resins. Most of the time today, what I do is depending on the piece, is I will use a clear coat of resin on top of my work so that it just appears to add another layer of, it just pops the colors. And so some of my larger pieces, my 4 foot by 3 foot pieces, they also have a coat of resin on the top.
Kent, a couple of comments. Lynn says on the one two back, the 4-part one, I think. She said, love that energy.
Oh,
And
it's fun here. Yeah.
Yeah. And can I ask you, on a painting like this, did you pour or did you paint with a brush, or how did you get that effect?
It's a combination of things. So the circle was done with a piece of cardboard that had the paint on it, and I just twisted it, laid everything together, and then turned it to get that movement there. The rest of this is done on this piece. I didn't use brushes. The blue, for an example, that was just done with my hands. And I just moved the paint with my hands. And a lot of times that's what I do. Sometimes I feel restricted with a brush and what I want to say and do. So out will come the rubber gloves, and I'll move the paint with my hands. And then the lines down the middle, those were done with a squirt bottle full of metallic paints. And that's how I applied those. And the smaller pieces, the gold, it's kind of hard to see with this, but there's gold in there. Those were basically thrown on the painting. So there wasn't a brush used in this one.
And was it separated before or after you painted it?
It was separated after. Yeah.
Okay.
So I needed a big area, and I put it together, and then I thought, this would be interesting pulling this apart, and let's see what happens with this. And I was really happy with the end result.
It's spectacular. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. We talked about George Morrison, and I think as there's things that happen in your life, at least with me, that really speak to me. I was invited to be a part of a George Morrison exhibition in Minneapolis, and it was called Changing Horizons. And how do I, he's the artist that I admire the most. And how do you represent that? What do I paint in order to be a part of that exhibit? Well, this piece began with traveling to Grand Portage one summer, and my wife and I were walking on the shores of Lake Superior, and I found this rock. And I thought, I need to use that somehow. And then I recalled one of the first pieces that I'd done with the washer. And I thought, okay, what colors next? And how do I represent that horizon line? And, yet I knew it was a gamble to do this. And my mother-in-law says, I don't get it. And I say, that's okay. Not everyone's going to get my work. So the fun part of this was that this piece was selected and it hung right next to a George Morrison piece when it was in Minneapolis. Oh, that was an honor. That really was an honor. Yeah. So I feel good about that. Some other examples of the work that I do. Most of the time my pieces are pretty big. This one was done with acrylic inks, and how I achieved this effect was to my canvas was very wet, and I would take the acrylic ink and I would start on the edge of the painting and just let it flow down, and then turn it the other direction and turn it this way and turn it that way, and work with the colors and blend the colors, not by using any brush, just by moving the canvas. And this was really a fun piece to do. I've done a few like this. This one now is an album cover with an artist out of Bemidji, Minnesota. And it's also in my exhibit in Grand Rapids that's going on right now. So I've learned how to work with acrylic inks as well. Sometimes in my work, you'll see a circle. Depending on the piece, that's important to me. And sometimes I think pieces just call for it. I'm sure you as artists understand this, that there's a point in your work where it creates itself. It demands certain elements. And sometimes my work demands a circle. And I think some of that has to do with the medicine wheel that we use in the Ojibwe culture, and just that circle of life. And so oftentimes you'll see, a circle either painted or represented in some other way. These pieces are done with acrylic inks. Recently, I was an educator, and the stress of the pandemic and teaching 150 students and 80 families how to all be on the computer at the exact same time, and how to teach teachers how to use technology to teach. It became overwhelming, and it started to take a toll on me physically and spiritually, I guess. And it came to a point where my doctor said, Kent, you need to take a break. It's going to be you or your job. You need to choose. You need to choose what's important now. And so I left education in November of 2021. And that was one of the hardest decisions I ever made, because like I said before, I love my community, and I consider it an honor to be teaching, you know, right in my own community and teaching these beautiful children. And so my job at the school was to teach technology, keep all the technology running. I also was the assessment coordinator. I would do all the testing, the state testing. And in my spare time, I would get a chance to work with small groups of kids and teach a little bit of art. It was mostly painting. And then I also did robotics as well. So I left in November, and I was pretty sick. My blood sugars were out of control. And all the numbers were going in the wrong direction. And all I knew at the time was that I needed healing. And how do you do that? Well, as an artist, you do that through your work. You do that through expressing yourselves, at least I did, in my art. And in the Ojibwe culture, you'll notice that there are three jingle dress cones on my paintings. And those started to appear in my work. And those represent healing. And, you know, I didn't know how. I didn't know how to start telling my story and how to start recovering from what I was experiencing. But I found myself getting in really just focusing on art, my art for me, not for anybody else, but for me. And some of these pieces started to show up. And so I began a series of 16 pieces that are called the Healing Song. And these are multimedia pieces that I created. They're all 30 by 15 on gallery wrapped canvas. In each piece is unique in its own. You'll see that I use foil leaf in my work. You'll also see some gemstones. You'll see Lake Superior stones in my work. They are attached to I had to find the right medium because, you know, I don't want these to fall off, you know, so, you know, I wasn't going to glue them. So what I found that works the best, at least for me, because I love texture, was I used glass bead medium. And that's what's holding these pieces on. But that also, because it dries clear, yet the texture's there, it handles paint very, very well. And it provides a wonderful texture that for some reason, it just fit these pieces. So in my Healing Song series, you'll typically see dance jingles. You'll see some rocks that are obstacles. Maybe you'll see some wood. You'll see some wire wrapped stones. You'll see washers. You know, a lot of different pieces to catch the eye, and they're shiny. I use a lot of metallics, and because I want people to notice them. I want people to stop and think and look and go, why did you start asking questions of themselves and asking questions of others? What is the intent of that?
Is the glass bead medium what glass beads are made out of?
Well, that I don't know, but you know, it's a medium that I think it's golden that creates that. And all it is a regular beading, but there's little small glass beads in the medium, and it provides this wonderful texture You know, I just found that that works really well, and it holds all these pieces. Anything that you can put on it, you won't be able to remove unless you were to use a hammer and chisel. So it's going to stay put.
There's a certain irony there, isn't there, Kent?
Yeah. Yes, I guess so.
I mean, it is another way that you've incorporated the culture, but
Yes.
not in the visible part of the work, you know?
Right. And I think, you know, people will ask, like my mother-in-law who says, I don't get it. But in these pieces, it was very, very important for me to have obstacles in the piece. There was also important for me to use the metals that I did in these pieces, because I wanted them to reflect the viewer. I wanted people to examine these pieces, but also see that's my reflection there. And looking at that means to look at yourself. And do you need healing from what we've all just experienced this over the last few years? And these pieces are about looking inside, and that's why I have the washer there with the white, and so that people, that's a hole to look at yourself and see what you find there. So this is my healing song series. It's been really popular, and you know, these were fun pieces to do.
And are they done on canvas also?
Those are all on canvas. Yep, they're in gallery wrap canvas, and they're 15 by 30s.
I notice kind of a lattice on the one on the left. There's kind of a dark black or dark blue lattice. Is that paint or is that a textural element?
That's a texture. That would be, I found that, I think at Hobby Lobby or Michael's, it just looked really, really interesting. It's not a lace, but it's heavier than that. Maybe it would be used in some kind of floral arrangement.
Okay.
But it's heavy, it's a heavy duty netting, and I paint over the top of that and put that in. This is where I am today. This brings me to some of my most recent work, and I don't know if I have another one here. Yes, I do. This is, like I said, I like to do work that's large so that I can use large brushes. This was done with an 8-inch brush, and it's primarily done with inks, and it's 36 by 48, and then over the top of that is a layer of clear resin, and so it's bright, it's bold, and it's shiny, and the colors pop. You'll notice it in the room. And so you know, these are the pieces that give me the greatest joy. And I think if I were to talk about the future, that these pieces, bright, bold, a little daring, and hopefully with movement, that's the kind of artist I've become, because this speaks to me, and this is the piece that I created to celebrate my improvement in health. My blood sugar readings are getting back to normal, and everything else is going well. And so the decision to leave, although it was hard, it was the right decision. And now I get to do my artwork full time. And it's been really busy. And it's been a beautiful experience because I can share these pieces with people. And as you know, it's so wonderful to be able to share your work and have people say, gosh, that's beautiful. And this is how it speaks to me. That's the best part of being an artist, because I really believe that when you paint what's in your heart, when you paint what's in your heart and you let that speak on the canvas or paper or however you're doing that. For me, that's how I'm honoring my heritage and telling my story, just like my grandmother did. You know, she had nobody to mentor her. There was nobody that said, this is what your basket should look like. These are the colors that you use. She was all self-taught, with the exception of that first experience she had. And so those baskets, I guess, and just like my work, come from the heart. And that brings me lots of joy. And I hope others too, you know, experience joy from my work. And so, you know, I could still be painting lakes, trees, teepees, and eagles flying. But it's become this now. This is where I'm at. This is what makes me happy today, and this is what I share. And you know, it took a long time. You know, it took me till I was in my late 50s to let go, But you know, I just want you to encourage you to, you know, tell your story through your artwork, and don't paint for anybody but you, and paint your heart. That's what I've learned to do. And when I started doing that, that's when the doors opened, and people started talking about my work and what I did. And there's so much freedom in that. It really is.
Nice texture in that painting.
Yes.
I like the texture.
Mhm.
So how do you get that?
That's
Ken?
there's the fingers. It's all
Okay.
finger work. This is a big
Wow.
piece. This is 36 by 36. It's all acrylics, and it's all done with my fingers. There's no brush involved in any of this, and it's layer upon layer. Usually I'll work on a piece. Sometimes things just happen, and I can, you know, get a piece done relatively quickly, but others take layers, and this was done over a 3-day period. And you know, I've been real happy with this, and it's been very popular. So
We've got a buildup of questions and comments. Ken,
sure. Okay.
Lainey would like to know, how is resin different from varnish?
Resin is you have to mix it. It's 2 parts. It's like a clear plastic, I guess. I can, you know, you know, that's the only way I can describe it. You have to mix the part A and part B together, and you mix it for 3 minutes, and then you pour a layer on top. And it's heavier than a varnish, much heavier than a varnish. And the nice thing about that is you can take resin and you can mix, excuse me, you can mix colors in the resin. I use dry pigments, and I'll put in the resin, and it suspends a layer of paint on top of your other paint. So it gives you that little bit of dimension, I guess. And you know, you can create a lot of interesting pieces with just using resin. But it's messy. Let me warn you, it's
Mhm.
very messy, and it can be expensive. And if you don't have the right resin, there's different varieties of resin. It can be very toxic. So you have to be careful with, I use something that's called art resin, and you don't have to have a mask on or anything like that with that resin, but there are some that, you know, it's very, very toxic. You don't want it on your skin, or you don't want it to breathe it in. So yeah, I don't do it a lot, but for these bigger pieces, these larger pieces, I chose to use resin because some of these larger pieces are going into our health centers in White Earth on the reservation, and also these bigger pieces are going in galleries. So on exhibition, so I don't have to worry about people touching them because they're protected.
Mhm. And you have a limited time with resin too, doesn't it?
You do, right. You have about, depending, 30, 40 minutes, depending, you know, on what type of resin you use and the temperature in the room and all of that. You can work the resin for, you know, for about a half hour or so, maybe even more, but it's a mess. It really is a mess.
Some other comments, like I did, I saw this also. I see feathers in that one. So in your healing one,
Yeah.
or not healing, the one after healing.
Is it this one here?
The circular motion.
Yeah. Yeah.
That one,
And
we saw a feather in there.
yeah. And people, you know, people will see, you know, I love to hear what people see. You know, that's the fun part of this, you know, and you know, people will see the colors, but then you know, then they'll see something, and that's always fun. I enjoy that.
I saw the feather, and then that led me to a little opening that was kind of a tunnel. Down
Mhm.
at the bottom, there's a little circular, an arch shaped.
Oh, sure.
And it
Yeah.
just felt like a tunnel going into that. It really is. Abstracts are just so fascinating for people to take
Yeah.
away what they see in it.
And that, you know, that involves the viewer. And I think that's the beauty of it, is that, you know, they're going to become involved in that, in your work. And, you know, I always get asked, what does that mean? And my response, my pat answer is, what are you seeing? Because it's really not so important for what I saw necessarily. It's what are you seeing?
Mhm.
And so, you know, I answer that question with a question. I know you're not supposed to do that, but I do.
Some other comments here. Love these colors. Some artists now are attempting to use materials that are in harmony with nature and the earth. Thank you, Kent. Your work and story is beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. I enjoyed hearing about your grandmother and your art. You're extremely talented. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. It's my pleasure. If I can talk, you know, about, not just because she's my grandmother, but because it's an important story that we do need to hear, and we don't hear enough about it. And its impacts are felt today. And so, you know, it's important. And I'm glad I was able to share that.
I have a couple of questions about your mentors. So did you ever study with George Morrison?
No, I did not. He died in the year 2000. But there's a wonderful documentary on him. If you go to PBS, if you can search for and PBS, there's a wonderful documentary about him and his life, and I would encourage you to watch that. And also, but you know, there's books. I've read as much as I possibly can about him, and I'm so glad I was able to find his work, because I would still be in that box. And now I kind of call it a box, because I would have been, you know, still painting very traditional landscapes. And in my heart, I was seeing this. So I'm glad I finally stepped away.
In the middle of your career, one of the works that was in 4 parts, 3 or 4 parts, I think, was very reminiscent of Jackson Pollock.
Oh,
And
yes, yeah.
you talked with Art and I a little bit about that. I wonder if you can talk about what you took. Yes, that one.
Sure. So one of the first museums that national museums that I went to, I had just started doing work, this type of work, and we went to the National Gallery, and one of the pieces there was a work by Jackson Pollock, and it and I still get a little emotional about it because it was for me it was an emotional moment, because this is the artist that I also had studied and just seen his work in magazines and in books, and to be standing a foot away from a Jackson Pollock, I broke down in tears and I had to sit down because it was too much. It was too real. And I was still that little boy painting on the barn and wishing someday, those memories came back of maybe someday I'll be able to see a real Jackson Pollock. Maybe someday I'll be able to go to a museum and actually being there and then seeing his work up close was just how powerful art can be. And in that moment, also knowing that I can do work like this. It's okay for me to express myself by throwing paint or having it move on the canvas in a different way than just using a brush. And so, those, I'm just so thankful that, that there are those artists that have made the way, and had so much power in their work that it would bring tears, to my eyes. And that's happened many, many, many times. This last winter, we went to New York and went through the galleries. And again, I saw in the Whitney, the work of George Morrison, pieces I had never seen before, never seen in books before. I saw them, and then being so close to a Monet painting, and it just it's just overwhelming, and what art can do and how it made me feel. And I thought, I hope someday, I hope with my work that I'm able to make people feel something. If I can do that, I've accomplished my goal. Not only for beauty, but also to have a feeling associated with that. So,
is there any place here in the Twin Cities where we could go and see your work in person, or is...
Right now, no.
Okay.
There's only one little gallery. It's called the Friedel Gallery.
Right on West 7th.
Yeah. I have a piece there right now. I don't know what is up next, what's coming next for me. I will be, right now I'm in Grand Rapids till the end of this month. This fall, I will be in the American Indian Housing Corporation building in Duluth with one piece, October through December. Right now, I'm getting ready for 2 of my Healing Song series that will be going in the Watermark Art Center beginning the first part of May. And I'm working on I think it's going to be a solo exhibit. I'm still working on the details on that for 2023 in Austin, Minnesota.
Okay.
So I'm still working on arrangements for that. So yeah, and right now I'm also a artist member of, if you ever get to Park Rapids, I'm going to be an artist member of Studio 176, and I will have a lot of pieces there. I'll be one of 4 artists this season, May through December. I'll have work, always have work there. So that's exciting.
Lynn, before you said that, Lynn just asked, how about the Park Rapids Gallery
Yeah.
176?
Yes, that's it. That's where I'm going to be.
I
This
think
is
she
a
has
new
a lake
venture.
cabin up there.
Oh, great. Yes, I have. This is a new venture for me. I was invited to be a part of the gallery, the studio there. So I'm looking forward to working with them and seeing how my work, people enjoy my work, I hope. So, yeah.
Wonderful.
Beautiful.
Well, can we end your screen share and get you back
Yes.
on the screen?
Sure.
There
we
we
go.
are. And I'd like all the members to unmute and let's give Kent our thanks with a round of applause. Thank you so much.
Yay. Thank you. It was
Thank you,
inspiring.
parents. Thank
Thank
you.
Good night.
you. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and now we're all going to learn an Ojibwe word. It's Giga Waba Min.
Giga
Waba
Min.
Yes, Giga Waba Min, and that is see
Giga
you
Waba Min.
later.
Okay.
Yes,
Giga Waba Min.
thank you
Giga
so
Waba
much.
Min.
Giga Waba Min.
Giga
All right, goodbye now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Kent.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.